Yo, what's up guys? So I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on my Scholar raid guides, and I've gotten many requests to make a dungeon guide. So here I am today to do that. I have a bit of a favorite saying that I like to tell the tank in every dungeon, and that is, it's impossible to pull too much. My goal is for you to have the confidence to be able to say the same thing, because if you can handle big pulls, then you can handle anything. Now, before I even start, I see a lot of other guides on YouTube that are overly specific as far as rotation, what to do when, and I think that this is a huge mistake because a good healer is dynamic, flexible, and able to adapt to any situation. When you're dealing with things like level sync or maybe a tank that's rather unpredictable, you can't expect a consistent environment. So I'm going to be talking about ideas that are applicable for any level in any situation, and that's just general overall good practices. So I'm going to break this up into 4 parts. First is going to be pre-pull or running. Second is going to be where we group up the trash and kill it. Third, I'm going to show an example of me doing a giant pull. And then finally, I'll add on some additional information. Tip number 1. Probably the most common mistake that I see with Scholar is people going into their pulls with not enough resources. I'm not just talking about mana or cooldowns. I'm talking about Aether Flow, and even Fairy Gauge if you're really high level. Starting a pull with 3 Aether Flow is not enough. If I'm expecting an absolute dump truck of a pull, then I try to prep at least 6 to 9 Aether Flow. How do you get 6 to 9 Aether Flow? Well, you have 3 Aether Flow on your gauge, you have your Aether Flow ability off of cooldown, and you also have Dissipation off of cooldown. That means 6 to 9 off global cooldown heals to weave between your AoEs or ad liquiums or anything you need to cast, not even mentioning fairy abilities. That is so much healing. Unfortunately, prepping this much Aether Flow can take over a minute, which is why tip number 2 is start prepping for the pull during bosses. Literally stop using your resources during boss fights and play worse. Literally play worse. I will cast ad liquium or succor or anything I need to clear the boss, so that way I don't have to spend any Aether Flow or cooldowns. Because I know that the trash pack following the boss is probably going to be harder to heal than the boss itself. On to tip number 3. I'm going to talk about what we do while we're running or before the pull. So obviously always prep the tank with a shield, and if you have XCOG as well, use that. The sooner we use it, the sooner it's off cooldown. Another thing is that I think it's pointless to hang on to quick cast for a res. If your tank dies, you're up shit creek regardless, so I'd rather spend the quick cast while we're running to get a second ad liquium on the tank. Beyond that, just, apply some dots, maybe cast Art of War or Rune, and that's the pre-pull. So to recap on everything that we need to do before we even stop and kill the trash is you need to prep at least 1 minute before the pull and build up as much Aether Flow as possible. Once we start running, we need to cast a shield and Excogination on the tank. Don't be afraid to use quick cast to apply a second shield on the tank. And beyond that, just keep up and do damage while you're running. Woo, that's the hard part. Alright, now all we gotta do is cast Art of War and force feed our tank full of lustrates. I guess there's a little more to say than just that, but Tip number 1 of the group up phase? You obviously want to use Whispering Dawn and Fey Illumination. Does it even need to be said, don't use Indomitability? Does that even need to be said? But Sacred Soil is a bit of a toss-up. Sacred Soil gets better the more enemies that are beating on your tank. So if your tank's doing baby pulls, don't use Sacred Soil, just cast Lustrate. But if your tank is trying to 1v50, then Sacred Soil gets a lot better the more damage he's taking. So my next tip is for scholars that at least have the Fairy Gauge unlocked. If you have the Fairy Gauge, that means that you have the ability Fey Union, also known as Aether Pact. Now, Aether Pact is really strong, and it's better than Seraph, so I would prioritize using Aether Pact or Fey Union above using your Seraph. And I would also be careful about interrupting Fey Union. It can be interrupted by giving your fairy any orders, such as Whispering Dawn, Fey Blessing, Summon Seraph, so just beware. Alright, so I think I've talked about things enough, so now let me show you. This is Shisui of the Violet Tides, and following this boss is one of the largest pulls in the game that you can do, minus one of the level 80 dungeons. Now, to reiterate, building up a lot of Aether Flow is step 1 and the most important thing that you can do. The boss is only half dead, but I'm focused on Aether Flow and mana. Just before the pull, shield the tank, and if you have XCOG, great, use it. Alright, next let's talk about the absolute most underrated spell of Scholar, and that's Art of War. I get like 15 casts of this off while we're running, and that's a huge amount of damage. I'm even ripping aggro from the tank, which is totally not an issue. You can just drag them right through his AoEs later. The only other thing that you need to think about is casting Ad Liquium while you're running, and this is where Swift Cast comes in, and what I talked about earlier. So, once the tank stops and groups up the mobs, I'm obviously going to use Sacred Soil in this situation. I have a ton of Aether Flow to burn through, and I can dissipate my fairy for 3 more. Everyone in the party is a little bit hurt here, but it would be a mistake to cast Succor or Indomitability. The tank seems to have aggro on everything at the moment, so I'm just going to ignore the pain and suffering of everyone else. And that's pretty much it. Dungeon healing is not that hard, and we don't need to make it complicated, which is why I tried to keep this video as simple as possible. However, I did promise you additional tips, so I'll get into that right now. Additional tip number 1. Right when the tank groups up the mobs and stops is the most dangerous point in the whole pull. For whatever reason, tanks often delay their mitigation by a couple seconds, but that can be enough time to take the tank from full to half. So just know, right when you stop, be ready for anything. Additional tip number 2. So I think a lot of people know that Ad Liquium shields do not stack. So if you're ever panic healing, it's better to alternate Ad Liquium and Physic. However, I also think that this is bad practice and try to avoid it as much as possible. Instead, maybe throw in the occasional Ad Liquium before you run out of Aether Flow, so that way you never even get into that situation. Does that make sense? I'd rather cast Ad Liquium, Art of War, Ad Liquium, Art of War, before I even get into a truly panic situation. Alright, on to additional tip number 3. So if you've ever watched another Scholar guide, I think a lot of them mention that they like to also shield themselves before the pull, and then later on they can deployment tactics the shield back onto the tank. I mean, this is cool and nifty, but let's be real, the shield is not that big, and if it makes you fall behind the tank even a little bit, then it's not worth it. I think it's better if you just stay nuts to butts to the tank and get more Art of Wars off. Alright, and last additional tip. Not enough people use repos. Sometimes the tanks mess up and don't grab an enemy, and you can fix that problem. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you everyone that has subscribed. I can't believe I've hit 100 subscribers. I honestly didn't think I would get here. I kind of thought that no one would really watch, but that totally has not been the case, and honestly, I'm blown away. The only thing that I can hope for now is that I keep making content that you think is worth watching. So, thank you so much, and have a good one.